Every day, Ameren, Illinois works to deliver reliable energy throughout the state to on-the-go families, in-the-know grandparents, and busy students. But did you know we also have ways to manage your energy? Paperless billing, outage notifications, pick a due date, auto pay, and so much more. So no matter who you are or how you use your energy, there's an option that's right for you. Learn more at amerenillinois.com/options.
Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Huddle Up with Howard. I'm Mike Claiborne. There's Howard Richards, and our special guest today, a longtime attorney and sports agent, and he's also represented a number of universities as well and coaches. He's Bob Lattinville with the William Morris Agency, maybe the biggest in the world. So, Bob, first of all, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure, Mike and Howard. Thanks for having me.
So
thanks, Bob. Good to see you, man. Happy New Year.
You guys have known each other for a long time, both Mizzou guys. And Bob, this has got to be a fun time for you in the business, representing coaches, working with universities and athletes. But it's changing, it seems like, every 20 minutes.
Yeah, it sure is, Mike. And you're right. This is the time of the year when the coaching carousel, at least in college, has started, well, to ebb a little bit. And then the NFL is going to pick up right after that. So from about Thanksgiving until, Valentine's Day is when the coaching carousel first starts with college and then morphs into the NFL.
Hey, Bob, it's my understanding that I believe it's this week, the AFCA, the coaching convention, is happening.
San Antonio starts on Sunday.
Yeah. How much goes into job movement during that week of that convention?
Well, I would tell you a lot of that has already taken place, Howard. But there will be a handful of coaches, particularly those that are somewhat recently out of a job, that are trying to make connections down there. But I would tell you, except for the staff at Miami, where Mario Cristobal just took over, most of those staffs are in place, and they're just trying to fit in a few additions. And so usually what they do is the head coach gets the job, and he will pick his coordinators. And most of the time, if it's a standing head coach from some other place like Mario was, he'll have his coordinators in mind and probably some of the assistants. If it's a younger coach or somebody that gets a head coaching job for the first time, he'll probably pick a more experienced coordinator and give that person one or two spots on their side of the ball. And then they're always trying to determine, look, if I got 10 on-field assistants, how am I going to split it up? Am I going to go 5 and 5, or am I going to have a separate special teams coach? And a lot of times that's dictated by the scheme you run. So interesting.
So the University of Missouri, of course, kind of went through that last year, bringing in Steve Wilkes, who brought in a number of coaches. There's also more movement this year. Tight ends coach and recruiting coordinator recently departed. He's gone to SMU. It was just announced last evening that the associate head coach or assistant head coach, Charlie Cheese Harbison, is stepping away as a safeties coach. So now there are 2 vacancies open on that Mizzou staff, along with the 8th player who just entered the transfer portal, Ncaa Wingo, this year for that team.
Yeah, I tell you, there's so much more velocity in transition than there ever was. And it's on the, Lane Kiffin put it best, free agency is now in college athletics. And I think that's 100% true. And so it's always somewhat the case with regard to coaches, although more velocity now. And now you're seeing the player transfers as well.
Bob, I want to go back to the coaching element, because it is quite intriguing in how coaches arrive at hiring other coaches. But I think what even is a bigger head scratcher is when a coach gets fired, we always think about the head coach. He goes away with a nice package. Terminations, they come differently as far as compensation after a termination. Walk us through how that process normally works, because we hear about a guy who's making, let's say, $5 million, but a lot of times he doesn't walk away with $5 million, because a lot of that money is built in incentives and also shoe deals and radio and TV deals. It's not hard money with respect to the university.
Yeah, that's a good point, Mike. And it's interestingly enough, is when you negotiate a coaching contract, whether it's pro or college, the first thing you talk about are the termination provisions, which is somewhat morbid, but that's where your mind goes, because and it's difficult to get your client focused on that, because he's caught up in the euphoria of just getting this job, right? And like, hey, look, let's get this done because I got to hit the road and start recruiting. But you got to reel them back in and go, hey, wait a minute now. I mean, this isn't just, a good idea. The fact of the matter is most of you guys have been hired to be fired. So let's consider the what if. And the what if is really more reality than, let's say, a legal exercise. And so that's where you go right away as you talk about, okay, termination without cause. So in the event you don't win enough football games or basketball games or whatever it is, what are you taking with you out the door? And the standard, although I say that term loosely, Mike and Howard, but the standard is essentially the balance of your base salary that would be due from the termination date through the end of the term. And then to that, there's usually an obligation, a mitigation obligation, meaning that you, as the employee that's been terminated, have a responsibility to reduce the liquidated damages of your employer, the university in that case, by finding other comparable employment. And you negotiate over that, like, okay, well, if I've been a head coach of some stature for a certain amount of time, you're not going to go force me to go take a job doing something I'm not skilled to do. So we'll discuss that. We'll negotiate, all right, what is comparable employment? And then there'll be a paragraph or two on, all right, well, did you receive market value for that other employment? Or are you trying to game our contract such that you're going to take an artificially low salary so that what the university owes you, the school that terminated you, is going to pay you more? So we'll argue about that a little bit. And then there'll be the offset. And most of the time, the offset's going to be dollar for dollar. So if you were making $5 million, and let's say 60% of that, or $3 million, was your base salary. All right, well, it's the $3 million. You got 3 more years on your deal. We owe you $9 million. You've got to mitigate our liquidated damages by finding comparable employment. You go find, let's say, a coordinator's position that pays you $1 million for the next 3 years. We owed you 9. You're making 3. The balance is 6. That's how it works. I'm oversimplifying, but that's essentially what happens. And those negotiations, again, are typically the ones that are the most pervasive in a contract negotiation, with the exception now of force majeure. Now we're all talking about that, right? Like, well, what happens if we have a pandemic? So I tell you what, I've those provisions, which used to be, Howard and Mike, 3 sentences, now they're 3 paragraphs.
Yeah.
You mentioned the term cause or not, or with cause or without cause. Very well-known case that just happened in the NFL not too long ago was the firing of Urban Meyer, the Jacksonville Jaguars head coach. And so my understanding that he it was fired. Shad Khan's trying to fire him with cause, I guess, basically because of the morals issues that he exhibited as the head coach. Any insight as to what's going on with Urban Meyer?
We represent Urban Meyer, so I have a ton of insight, and we can share that over a glass of wine, Howard.
Or maybe a bottle.
What I will say about cause generally is, there are what I'll call garden variety circumstances, or what lawyers call grounds for cause. And some of them are obvious. I mean, to the extent that you don't perform your duties. And so there'll be a whole list of duties that you're responsible for. And to the extent that you don't perform them, and I'm not talking about how well you perform them, but to the extent that you don't perform them, that's typically grounds for cause. As you might imagine, there's some other layups, right? So to the extent that you violate the law above a certain, what I'll call, threshold of severity, right? You're not a parking ticket or a speeding ticket, but something like a felony. And a lot of times we'll spend a lot of time negotiating, all right, what is that threshold that you cross? Then there will be a whole host of, and what you're talking about, Howard, I think is the most difficult thing to deal with regard to cause, is what we'll call morals clauses. So without talking about Urban, not trying to dodge your question, but understandably, I've got, confidences I need to keep. But we'll have a whole discussion about it. All right, well, to the extent that some conduct takes place that's really hard to quantify the damages. Let me use another example where we don't represent the coach. Take a look at the Raiders intrusion this year, right?
Yeah,
look at that particular circumstance. And in the last week, I was negotiating the employment contract for Becky Hammond, who is the women's basketball coach that left the Spurs and took the job for the Aces. Well, they're owned by the Raiders, right? So you can imagine the morals clause that they had proposed, and actually was dealing with the Raiders president, who's wonderful to deal with. But we had a whole conversation about, well, gosh, what happens if? And so trying to determine what should be applicable isn't standard. It's very, very unique. And so I would tell you this. the discussions that I've had, for example, representing a football coach at Baylor in a small Texas town for a Baptist school is wholly different than the time I spend negotiating that contract or those contracts and those clauses for a coach at UCLA who's in the middle of Los Angeles. So it's kind of interesting. There are what I would say some boilerplate provisions, but a lot of times, to the extent that you've got language in there that I often see is like, it offends the morality of the community, or it's an act of moral turpitude. Well, I'm an old guy, Howard. I've been practicing law for 31 years. I don't know what the hell moral turpitude is. It's something different wherever you are, right? So infinite, what we always try to do is put it in examples, Art. Well, and to the extent I've got an example, say, all right, well, that's offensive or that's embarrassing. All right, well, losing, the Jags lost 50-10, I think, Claibs to New England this past week. That's embarrassing, but that shouldn't be grounds for cause, right? So you're always building in there, hey, one loss record shouldn't be it or whatever it is. But so we identified as best we can with language what the trigger is. And then I always like to have is the attorney for the employee is, all right, well, there's got to be some damage that results out of that. And so how do we quantify that? And again, that's what we spend a lot of our time on, is trying to, all right, what's the threshold? How do we identify it objectively? And is there really damage as a result of what happened?
He's Bob Lattinville. Howard Richards is here. We'll take a break and be back after.
At St. Louis Acura, our customer-focused approach keeps earning us more inventory. As others increase their fees and take advantage of limited inventory, we keep our prices low because we remain committed to becoming better than ever and treating you as we want to be treated. We want you coming back and sending your friends and family to a veteran-owned, family-based business you can trust. Blessings for a wonderful holiday season and a prosperous new year from our families to yours. St. Louis Acura, better than ever for you.
Welcome back, everybody. Huddle Up with Howard, Mike Claiborne, Howard Richards, our special guest, Bob Lattinville, the William Morris Agency. Bob, one of the things I wanted to run by you is, the language becomes more creative in the contracts these days. But what are you seeing trend-wise as far as how a lot of these contracts are written up, not just for coaches, but you've been on the other side where you've also worked with universities as well. Are you seeing any trends as far as clauses are concerned?
I am. And so to kind of borrow the clause of the day, here's what I'm seeing mostly with regard to force majeure. So we'll take a look at, there was what we typically would call acts of God, right? And it could be anything from a war or a riot. And now, of course, pandemic is a part of that. And so you're trying to determine, all right, again, what is a force majeure event? What is an event that causes damage to the university? And so that's usually where we start. I'm like, well, what is the trigger? And so the first thing that we discuss in those clauses, which never was discussed before, was, all right, well, from an economic standpoint, what should be our trigger? I just finished an athletic director contract within the last couple of weeks, and we were talking about, all right, to the extent that revenue, and we're talking about like non-charitable revenue, not donations, but revenue from operations. And that comes from all forms, whether it's ticket sales or concession sales or parking or revenue that you get from the conference. In this particular case, it was the SEC. To the extent that revenue, not including charitable contributions, is 20% less than the preceding year, that's the trigger. Okay, so all right, now we know we've got an economic problem here. What are we going to do about it? And so then that's where the procedure comes in. And so what I see quite often in those circumstances, once you identify the trigger claims, then they start talking about, all right, well, then what are we going to do about it? Usually, if you can get some cooperation from the university, or if I'm representing the university, we'll say, all right, well, let's give the party some opportunity to be reasonable here. Let's not just impose something because, say, for example, we think that the event, whatever it is going to be short-lived, right? Although that's not the case with the pandemic, for heaven's sakes, this looks like it's going to go on for another year or so. But you try to identify, all right, well, for what amount of time are we going to address this issue? And so a lot of times you'll say, all right, well, if it's a 20% or greater reduction in our revenue based upon certified financial statements, we're going to give you 14 days to try to resolve something. If we can't get something resolved, then what are we going to do? All right, we're going to give you some options. And one of those options may be we can reduce your base compensation by 25% up to 12 months, whatever it may be. Or we can delay paying you for a year, 50% of your compensation, delay paying you for a year. And when that period is over, then we'll pay it back to you over time, whatever it may be. Or if it's egregious enough, let's say it's somewhere above 30% or 40% or whatever, we've got the right to terminate you for cause. And again, not that you did anything wrong, but the fact of the matter is we don't have the resources to pay you. And so that's what you see that you never saw before. Again, these provisions were 2 and 3 sentences, Mike, and now you'll spend a page on them, and those are usually the issues. All right, what should be the trigger? And when we have the trigger, what should we do about it? And what's a fair amount of consideration you should give for the economic challenges that the university are facing? Those I'm paraphrasing, but those are essentially the issues that we deal with in that particular provision. Now, another thing, and slow me, Klebs, because I'll start rambling here, but another thing that I see now is a lot of times, and you brought up Coach Meyer, Howard, and there's other coaches that, when they terminate the head coach and they, for whatever reason, but particularly cause, they're like, hey, wait a minute now. I just hired a staff of 10. And I hired a director of football operations. I got all these video guys, and hey, that's great. And now whoever I bring in, he's going to get rid of all of them. And I had to give multi-year contracts to your coordinators and your quarterback coach or whatever. Not only do I owe you, in our example, $9 million, I also owe your staff another $8 million, right? Well, their situation is a microcosm of the head coach. Typically, they have mitigation obligations and offsets, but the thing about it is when you take a look at in the aggregate, when you terminate a head football coach, how many people are displacing? And I don't mean to embellish because it sounds like the agent in me, but the fact of the matter is you terminate a head coach, there's at least 100 people walking out the door, right? When you talk about wives and kids and all that stuff, I mean, it's a big deal. It's an absolute big deal. I say this not to pick on this particular coach. I won't say him by name, but do you remember there was a coach in the Pac-12 that bet on an NCAA basketball game somewhat foolishly, and all that staff gets kicked out of there? I'm like, are you kidding me, coach? Yeah. Really? That's in your contract, and we all get booted because you decided you want to participate in an NCAA basketball pool? Crazy. And I think about that. All right, well, how bad is it? Well, Neuheisel walked out the door with X, Y, and Z, right? Well, all these other coaches, like, I just got here. I don't have a guaranteed contract, and now I'm out, right? And so, again, and I think the more thoughtful coaches recognize that, and they include in their contracts some sort of protection for their staff. And so a lot of times they'll give up money on the high end in order to get the best staff available. And I always tell those guys, and I think it's particularly important, you've got to have loyalty on your staff. That's critically important. Even I would say if you had to have a trade-off as to what's particularly important, like if you're the head coach, you can coach that staff up in what your scheme is and how you want to recruit and all those different things. But you want to have all 10 of your people, as well as your off-field folks, focused on your job and winning and being loyal to you. Because to the extent that they have their eyes on the door, and you're essentially, coaching with 7 because you got 3 other guys that are always looking to move on, you're at a decided disadvantage. And so it's worth giving up some of your compensation and some of your job security in order to make those guys on your team and their families feel secure and rowing hard with you, because it's a grind.
I think that's you mentioned the term loyalty. If you look at the difference between 2 guys that came up in the same system, the guy that was on our show a few weeks ago, Gary Pinkel, former Mizzou head coach, compared to his former teammate at Kent State, Nick Saban, their coaching experience, their coaching trees have gone in different directions. Saban has not been afraid to tinker with his staff. I mean, bringing in guys every year, every other year, whereas Gary Pinkel was very common knowledge that he was very loyal to his assistants. I mean, he had assistants that stayed with him 10, 15, some cases 20 years.
Yeah.
And so I can see how, based on the individual, how it works from their vantage point of what it takes to build a coaching staff and how it works with recruiting and all that versus someone like Saban, where the pressure is a lot higher at the University of Alabama than it is probably anywhere else.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really, really good point that you make, Howard. And because they've been so successful, obviously, coach has got, he has to recognize that there is going to be turnover because being part of that coaching tree is alluring to universities. Absolutely. And the one thing I love Coach Pinkel. My gosh, if you're a Missouri fan, how can you not love Gary Pinkel for a host of reasons?
Yeah.
But I would tell you this too, just from an economic standpoint, that continuity in your staff is really economically efficient. Not having that constant turnover, not having to recreate those relationships. And so it's somebody that we all know and we all love, like Andy Hill. I was so glad to see Andy Hill stay there because there are connections that a guy like Andy Hill has that are almost, you can't develop those overnight. And so to have him on, different staffs for all those many years, I thought was particularly important. And that continuity is smart business. It saves the university money. When you don't have the turnover, you don't have all those opportunity costs, or what I call dead money. You're not paying coaches that aren't there, right?
All right.
Hey, Bob, how much of an impact are you seeing, and this is obviously new to all of us, the transfer portal and the impact it's having on college sports? And certainly I think it's going to have an impact on coaches as well, because we've seen coaches up and go, at the drop of a hat for years. Now the players are doing it. How much of an impact do you think it's going to have on coaches and their futures?
Well, I think I had the circumstance with a basketball coach last year, and the number of student athletes that opted for the transfer portal. In this particular case, it was 7. And, in college basketball on the men's side, there's only 13 scholarships, right? So, that's more than half the roster. And so that was pointed to by the athletic director when they terminated him. It's like, look, you're obviously not you're obviously not providing the experience that these student athletes thought they were going to receive. Now, that being said, and particularly now as I'm the father of a teenager, I'm like, wait a minute, right? It's like I know what I told my daughter, but what she heard was something completely different, right? And so I think what ends up happening. Let me state the obvious. I think I'm good at that. It's like, look, you continue to have to re-recruit your roster all the time, and if you've got like a better roster, like the Alabamas or the Clemsons or the Georgias, whatever it may be, it's like those kids were the best of the best, and they're not used to sitting on the bench. And so I think that a couple things come out of that. You got to continue to recruit your roster, which you probably should have been doing anyway. But if it's at a critical position like quarterback or receiver or something like that, at a skill position where the mindset, and Howard, you can speak to this much better than probably anybody on the planet, is like offensive linemen recognize they need to develop, right? They're like the most team-oriented guys infallibly. They just are. But the skill guys are always just like, they're more me guys. I'm sorry, I'm just going to say it. They just are, right?
The truth is the truth.
Right. You've got to, I don't want to say cater to, but you've got to recognize that mentality and address it somehow. And then also there's practical considerations, all right? How many guys do you expect to lose off your roster as a result of attrition, right? And so then how does that weigh into how you're going to recruit? If I've got 25 scholarships, assuming, all things being equal, 25 scholarships to give this year, how many am I going to hold back from my high school offers or JUCO offers to account for attrition? And so, will I lose or gain in this particular circumstance? And I also think one of the things that I think is helpful, like the positive residue that I see of this, Mike, is it's going to, in my opinion, reward the honest. Because when you sat down, I told you weren't going to start, okay? And you ended up, this is what I told you, right? But mom and dad, if he does these things, he's going to have an opportunity to compete next spring or whatever it is. Now, remember, this isn't a sprint. This is a distance race, so on and so forth. And for those folks that recruit that way and are honest, I think it'll benefit them. And it also, one more thing that it does, again, apologize for rambling, is, you're going to want to make sure that, to the extent that you don't get that 4-star or that 5-star in the early signing period, stay in touch with them to the extent you can. Or don't end it on an ugly note, because the chances are you got a decent chance to get that kid back if he doesn't. Right. 100%. So just some thoughts, but and not Bob Lattinville's thoughts, but the thoughts I've heard over and over again from the coaches that we represent. There's some practical issues involved there, and how you manage your roster is one of them. Like not unlike an NFL circumstance, really not at all.
Bob Lattinville is our guest. Hey, Bob, you've been on both sides of this thing, name and likeness. Universities have to figure something out quick because this is the hot item. I heard Seth Greenberg say, now we're making cheating official now. And that's basically something we've known that has taken place with boosters over the years. Now you can pay them on the top, and the NCAA is backed out of this thing because they don't want to have anything to do with it. Where do you think we'll go with this? Because it's something that's so new. Some guys have already profited from it, but everybody's not. So where do you think we're going with it?
Well, I tell you, it does need to be a lot more defined. And you're right, Mike. The NCAA has really stepped back from it. And so I would say this. Now, the amateurism rules still are in place. You can't pay for play. But that begs the question is, well, what exactly does that mean? Okay, so I think a lot of times by stepping back, they've created more issues than they otherwise would have had. But I understand why they did it, particularly in the wake of the Alston case and some of the other circumstances where they've been beaten up in court. But if you take a look at it, essentially top down, what are the things that you're considering if you're a high school athlete or college athlete? All right, well, what do the NCAA guidelines provide? Well, they're pretty open. There's not a lot of bumpers, not a lot of guardrails involved in that, except for the amateurism rules. And then you get down to, all right, well, does your state have a law that impacts you? And most laws, to the extent that a state has a law, like Missouri or Texas or whatever, there's applicability with regard to high schools and colleges. A lot of times it's the same or roughly the same. The only state that I can say that I've read the law and definitively as a high school student athlete, you can participate in NIL activities is not surprisingly California. Okay, but you got to be mindful of that, and it's one of the reasons why, for example, the good quarterback who left. Oh gosh, I can't think of the Texas quarterback who took the job. Took the scholarship offer at Ohio State. Now he's transferring back. Forgive me, I can't think of the young man's name. But in any event, he ended up gray shirting and coming out earlier because he had the opportunity to capitalize on his NIL at Ohio State, whereas he couldn't while he continued to be a high school athlete in the state of Texas. So you've got the NCAA, then you've got state law, and then there's the own university NIL rules. And for the most part, those university NIL rules are they're simple. I was like, you have to report the deal that you've reached. And the reason for that is you want to make sure that it doesn't violate the amateurism rules or pay for play. And then there is a paternalistic perspective to it too. They don't want you, for example, negotiating a deal with Coca-Cola when they've got Pepsi pouring rights in the stadium, whatever it might be. So that comes out. And then finally, you got to take a look at the national governing bodies, right? So we always think, I say we, but I always think about like women's basketball, men's basketball, and football is the ones I'm always in my mind. But you've got swimmers and you've got hockey players and you've got golfers, right? That all might have the opportunity to play their sports as an amateur going forward, and that is a valuable qualification to have, particularly if they're potential Olympians, right? So you got to check with your national governing body as well. I'm like, all right, well, if let's say, for example, I'm a women's golfer, and I want to give lessons at Wake Forest, can I do that? Well, there's some specific rules that USGA imposes, and for the most part, you can't be a teaching pro and maintain your amateur status. To the extent that you're teaching someone, you got a club in your hand, you're out. You're no longer an amateur. Now, can you give a clinic and not pick up a club? Yes. And is that a matter somewhat of semantics? Yeah, for the most part, but it matters. And so it's somewhat of a complicated matrix that student athletes are dealing with. And I would tell you, it's why most schools like Missouri, Howard, I think our program's called Trademarks, I believe.
Something
in Illinois,
like that,
it's called Influence. They have a designated NIL person there that helps the student athletes when they're being recruited and why they're student athletes to walk through all of the rules and make sure they're compliant. But I will say this, getting back to Mike's point earlier, which I think is a great one. It's like, how in the world is the NCAA ever going to rein that back in at this point? It's going to be really, really challenging. I think ultimately what's going to happen is you will see in the one kind of governing body we haven't talked about in this context are the conferences. And I think the conferences are going to play a much bigger role in what happens with regard to NIL.
Well,
so I've got two. I was
just going to say this real quick. I think that we're going to see these Power 5 conferences secede from the NCAA as we know it, and they'll set up their own rules that'll make it more profitable for them and more rewarding. They won't need the NCAA because the TV networks will gladly take the Power 5 conferences compared to the Yankee Conference or some of the conferences they're forced to put on the air that nobody cares about. So the NCAA's got to walk very smartly here because these guys will pick up their bags and move on.
I think that's right, and I also think from an antitrust perspective, it allows greater flexibility. Now, that's not to say just because the power is somewhat diffused or you have other options in terms of where you play or where you coach, you've got unbridled authority to make any rule that you want. But that setup is much more antitrust friendly than the current NCAA model. And as we've seen ever since 1984, the NCAA just really struggles with regard to the antitrust issues. And I think they've probably now to the point that they've started redrafting their constitution. I think they've recognized that. And Mike, it would not surprise me at all to see a secession from the NCAA, from the Power 5. I don't know if it'll go that far, but I wouldn't be surprised if it did.
Yeah, we've been talking about that, and I could easily see it, even from the standpoint of just governance with regard to beyond NIL, just regular rules violations, like the case that happened to Missouri a couple of years ago with the instructor. The team ended up, or the school ended up on probation. Sure. So you could see how the NCAA just kind of creates another layer. These conferences. And I know the SEC very well, of course, being in athletics administration for a while in Mizzou and being down at the league office for various meetings, you could see how the league in and of itself could essentially govern itself, its member schools, without worrying about what the NCAA does.
Hey, let's take another break, our final break with Bob Lattinville. But first,
the pandemic has been the ultimate game changer for many companies, and Ameren, Illinois is no exception. President and Chairman Richard Mark tells us how they've worked with their customers who may have been harshly impacted by COVID.
The pandemic has really caused some unprecedented changes and challenges for all industries. And, for us, since we provide that vital service, we understand customers have to have it. And so with the pandemic, many people were out of work, didn't know when they were going back to work. So some of the things that we tried to do was say, how do we help those customers along? How do we provide some money to make it available if they couldn't pay their bill? How could we maybe suspend late fees and late payments and those types of things? So what we try to do is work with our customers. We provided last year over $26 million in billing assistance for customers to help. And basically, if the customers couldn't pay, we didn't cut anyone off and tried to just understand what was going on in the communities. And I think that's really the real core and basis of what we try to do.
Final segment with Bob Lattinville. Howard, take it away.
So we've seen just two more questions on NIL. I know universities and colleges are forming their own departments, or they'll have a staff that's dedicated to NIL deals. You, as an agent, you represent a particular player or players. What's the first step? Do you go and say, I've got a deal for player X. Let's talk to the compliance staff to make sure that we're all on the up and up. And then secondly, do you see in the future, national legislation governing this to make the playing field even across the board for at the FBS levels? Just say that.
Yeah, great questions. Let me take the last one first. Yes, I do see national legislation eventually coming into play. Now, how long that takes might be a while. Although I will say this, one of the things that seems to accelerate law with regard to sports is because when people want to get elected, it's a high profile issue, right? So they bring in, oh, I'll pay attention because it's about sports or it's about state U, right? So I think that is I'll call it somewhat of a saving grace, because I do think you need to have a level playing field here. Sorry to use the stereotype, but that you do. And we don't have that right now. And it's just confusing, frankly. It's really, really confusing. And so, a lot of times it gets reported that, this student athlete ended up going to that particular school because he had a better opportunity to raise his profile or monetize it, whatever it may be. And so I think legislation national legislation needs to happen. It will take a long time. But unlike, for example, legislation about regulating agents who nobody cares about, and to the extent that people do, they don't like them anyways, right? We don't really care so much about that. But in this particular circumstance, hey, let's protect state U. Let's take care of our student athletes. I think that's something that's high profile and interesting, and hopefully that accelerates federal legislation, because I think it's absolutely necessary. Now, how do we handle
I can see Tommy Tuberville sponsoring a bill on this.
He is.
Yeah.
Okay.
I said I could see him being the lead guy on this.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm
sorry, Mike.
Let me run this by you. Antonio Brown was just released.
Yeah, you saw that.
And so here's my question, because I think I shared it with you. If I were the Tampa Bay Bucks, I would have not activated. I would have just paid him his money. It's only one more week, and I just wouldn't activate him, because I was of the belief that Brown was going to complain about the fact that they tried to make me play when I was hurt. And maybe they settled on some sort of deal on releasing him, but I would have never activated him. Oh, you're hurt. I can't put you on the field. You're hurt. You told us you were hurt. That's why you walked off, because I always felt like he would come back at them and use that as a complaint and file a grievance against the team.
Mike, did you read his tweet last night?
I'm trying to stay as far away from him as I can, including his tweets.
Well, I think I think you're prescient. That's exactly what he's trying to do. When I read his tweet, he essentially, hey, look, I was hurt, and I had an MRI scheduled for Monday, and I took it, and they found, I'm paraphrasing and perhaps incorrectly, but they found bone chips in my ankle, so on and so forth, and how, this was about me. They cut me before, and so, effectively they had cut me while I was injured. I mean, that's exactly where I think he's going. At least that's one place where he's going. But that was, I know it made for great TV, but that was just sad to me.
Yeah,
it was just sad.
I saw another report subsequent to the statement saying that the Bucks released him, that apparently he had about $2 million in incentives that he and his representative tried to get guaranteed before the season ended, and the club said no. So I wonder how much that had to do with it as well. But you're going back to the fact that, hey, if you're injured and you had an MRI and you think you're hurt, why are you dressed out? Why are you even on the sideline?
Exactly.
Why'd you even play, period? So I know that this thing is not probably going to be over for a while until we actually get to what the real truth is.
Yeah, and that's just it. I mean, what is the truth out there? And the fact of the matter is, I mean, it'll be resolved. It'll be resolved in a grievance arbitration, which is supposed to be confidential, but there'll be leaks. There's always leaks, and then you're like, all right, well, if I can't really read the transcript, then what in the heck's going on? What really is going on? So I think we'll probably, be left to wonder still, even when however it gets resolved. I think we'll still be left to wonder, because hard to say. You kind of have to parse what's being reported as, all right, well, what's the source? What's his take? What's the, why does he have that particular position? So perhaps we'll never know,
Hey, Bob, before we get out of here, you've been at this a long time. You've represented free agents. You've represented some of the best in coaching and universities. And you've seen this industry change a great deal. But for you personally, is there one crowning moment, one thing that you come to appreciate in saying to yourself, this is why I chose to get in this business?
Yeah, I will tell you this. I don't necessarily have to use the individual's name, but it's when you think about sports, for 99.9% of the people, not us three on this call, but it's not their business. It's a form of entertainment. Okay. And so when I think about it being a business, I look at it, and so often you can look at it with a jaundiced eye, but the thing that I think is the best part of my job is, at the end of the day, no matter how accomplished these guys are, these coaches, most of the time it started with like a dream when they were like a little kid, right? And so they're kind of pinching themselves like, I'm doing this for a living, right? I just handed the game ball to my mom, and she was there at Matthews Dickey 20 years ago. I mean, that's the kind of stuff. And if it sounds corny, I don't care. I love it, and like I'm an old guy, so I've been practicing law for like 31 years, and I sit around with my lawyer buddies or whatever, and they're like, a lot of them that are infinitely smarter than I am, they left the business, or they're doing something else, or they're complaining about this or that, or we're like, you know what? I still get jazzed up to do my job because of that, for those particular reasons. And if you feel like, all right, well, you've truly helped somebody, and they've listened to your counsel, and hopefully it's improved as you got older. You've learned baptism by fire and certain things to do, and they've set themselves up for life because fortunate, and they can thank God for this. They stayed healthy, or they had some opportunities, but they took advantage of them. And to feel like you played a small part in helping them and their families, and then also helping them realize a dream. Again, a very, very small part. I never blocked, tackled, or anything professionally or whatever, but feeling part of that, man, that still blows my hair back, and it gets me excited to go to work, even as an old guy.
He's Tom Hagen. He's actually Tom Hagen. His name is Bob Lattinville. He is the great consigliere. Bob, hey, man, this has been a blast, and we thank you so much for being part of this. We've been trying to do this for some time, and your wisdom and your experience, I hope that everybody gets as much out of it as we did.
Bob, you're the best, man. Thank you so much. What a great conversation today, and please come back, because there's going to be, in 6 months from now, there's going to be a whole range of things that we can talk subsequent to today's conversation.
I'll look forward to it. You guys are the best. Thanks for having me.
All right. He's Bob Lattinville. That's Howard Richards. I'm Mike Claiborne. We thank you for checking us out today on Huddle Up with Howard.
The only thing faster than this supersonic golf cart are the closing times at thehomeloanexpert.com. Mortgage rates on the twos, and we have a 21-day closing guarantee. Apply online today at thehomeloanexpert.com.